So with that, to kind of make it a little easier for you. Just go right to here.
Thank you.
That gives you a little bit.
Yeah.
A little easier to use.
Yeah.
I could use Nazi or German. Yes, they told me to. Yes.
All right, good evening.
Good evening.
How are y'all?
Good.
Are you ready for fascists? Sort of an odd question. Anyway, I'm Linda Kuhn. I'm Dean of the Honors College, and this is part of our sneak preview of our fall 2019 signature seminars, where we invite top research faculty to partner with ambitious undergraduates from multiple disciplines and colleges. Our first preview is Dr. Kelly Hammond, who will be talking about fascists, followed by Dr. Kevin Hall, who will be giving a seminar on engineering antiquity, followed by Padma Viswanathan, who's going to be talking about She Done It, female criminality in reality and literature. So those are all coming up. Take a look out for them. But tonight, it's my great pleasure to introduce my colleague, Kelly Hammond, who actually I had to fly in for this lecture because she's such a jet setter. Right now she has a very prestigious fellowship at the Library of Congress. She's a Kluge Fellow. That follows a whole series of high-end fellowships that have taken her around the world, from China to Taiwan to Japan to a whole series of other scholarly places. She is our modern Asian historian. She works on the period of the 1930s and 40s. She's just finished a fantastic book called China's Muslims and Japan's Empire. She's an expert on the Pacific arena of World War II, hence today's talk. But I think that Professor Hammond is going to be talking about then and now. Well, that's why you're all here, right? Of course, also, as a historian, I can say the then is quite fascinating also. So, you're not here to hear me, so I'm going to turn it over to the pro, my colleague and friend, Dr. Kelly Hammond.
Hi, thank you. Thank you to everyone for coming this evening. I really appreciate people coming out and taking their time to be here. And I also need to take a moment to thank Dean Kuhn, as well as the staff at the Honors College. Dean Kuhn really has this ability to bring in great staff, and they really are, as in her words, you could call them rock stars. So they've been very good at facilitating all of the sort of publicity for this class, and I really want to thank her and the Honors College for doing that. I'm also thrilled to have a chance to teach a class like this, because as an educator, it's one of those sort of rare opportunities where we get to be in the classroom and sort of think through some of the things that we're working on ourselves with a thoughtful and engaged group of students. So it's really a great opportunity, not only for students, but for the faculty as well, to sort of help us, look at things in different ways or take on new areas of research. So I'm really looking forward to meeting some of the students who will be taking this class with me. So I've kind of structured this talk as a way to introduce myself and my own research a little bit, and then I'm going to give you some of the reasons why I think that it's important that I teach this class at this moment. And this is sort of like a sales pitch to see if you guys want to join me next fall. And I remember, so Dean Kuhn and Dr. Swedenberg and I walk our dogs together every week. And about a year ago, I remember I was walking with Dean Kuhn and I said, I really want to teach one of those honors signature series. What if I taught a class called Fascists? And she just stopped and her jaw dropped and she said, we're going to make that happen. So here we are, a year later, Sunday dog walks to a class named Fascists. So this is the image that I've chosen to represent the sort of publicity and PR for this class. And so I think it's important to contextualize my own history and my own research as a way to understand why I'm teaching this class. So I'm actually, as Dean Kuhn said, I'm a historian of 20th century China and Japan. And my field of study is the history of Islam in China. I'm trained as a specialist in the history of Islam in China. But my first book is about Japanese imperialism and the ways that the Japanese Empire was using Muslims from China to create sort of broader networks to what we might call the Muslim world. So through Chinese Muslim interlocutors, they were using these Muslims to create networks to the Middle East, to North Africa, and even as far abroad as the Nation of Islam in Detroit. So my main research languages are Chinese and Japanese, although I do work in French, and if you tie me down to a desk and force me to, I can read Italian. So I do use Italian sources also in my book. So that just kind of gives you a little bit of an idea of where I situate myself as a researcher. And I'm generally interested in the ways that geopolitics impacts the movement of individual people and flows of goods and commodities throughout history. And so, what do I mean by this? So for example, how did the signing of the Anti-Comintern Pact in 1936, this was a pact that was entered at first by the Japanese and the Nazi Party as a way to sort of resist communism, resist the Soviets, and then later entered by the Italians and the Spanish and other fascist countries who joined later. So how did the signing of the Anti-Comintern Pact facilitate or impede the movement of Eastern European Jews from Europe to Asia? Or why, during the Second World War, did a place like Shanghai become a refuge for Jewish refugees that were fleeing Nazi Germany? And how did this actually happen? So here, this is a photo of a young Jewish refugee who moved to Shanghai. She's going to school with her Chinese neighbors, and she's living in an area of Shanghai called the Stateless Refugee Community, which was a mix of Jewish refugees as well as Chinese population. And there was around 30,000 Jewish refugees that made their way, if they had enough money and they could make their way all the way over to Shanghai, they were generally kept safe by the Japanese Empire. So here we have the sort of intersection of Nazi ideology and Japanese imperial ideology, but the Japanese could never really make a good case for persecuting Jews because there aren't really that many Jews in East Asia. So they sort of kept these Jews safe during this period and decided not to intern them. They didn't send them back to Germany, and this population was able to, this group of people, if they had enough money to make it to Shanghai, was able to live. So one of the questions that I'm sort of interested in, or when I think about myself as a historian, I consider myself to be a social historian who is concerned with the ways that larger political structures and ideology impact the decisions of individuals made on at the locality or on a daily level. Okay. So, if you're so inclined as to let me know, what do you think about when you think about fascism or fascists? If you want to yell it out, I'd be happy to entertain.
Nazi Germany.
Nazi Germany. Okay, that's usually the most prominent one that comes to people's minds.
Extremism.
Extremism. Good. I knew that was coming. I was just waiting for that. Yeah, and so when we think about fascists or fascism, I want you guys to keep these things in mind, sort of Nazi Germany, Trump, if you want to, extremism. And the way that I am thinking about teaching this class is that I really want to put these ideas into a different framework than you might be familiar with. So why do I specifically want to teach this course at this time? I'm a part of something, a group that's run out of Columbia University and a number of universities in Germany, and it's called the Working Group on Global Fascist Imperialisms. And it's run by a woman named Victoria de Grazia, who teaches at Columbia University. And every year, she brings together, every year, 18 months or so, she gets together around 25 to 30 scholars who work on the sort of history of fascism, and we sit in a room for 3 days in Germany, because the Germans have more money to support projects like this, and we talk about what people are working on, and we support each other. And the last time I was at one of these symposiums, which was about a year ago, I actually started my talk by raising two questions or two sort of things that I've noticed since we've been there and have in this forum that we are having. So I got ready for my presentation about Japanese militarism in China during the Second World War, and I really started with two statements. I mentioned that as someone who studies Japanese imperialism or Japanese fascism, I generally feel like an egregious outlier or an anomaly in these conversations, like an afterthought. I sort of think of it as like if you're reading a world history textbook and then at the end of the chapter, there's like a section about women that someone is like, oh yeah, we had to include women in this world history book, and someone just kind of added them in at the end. That's generally the way I feel about, here we are, it's a working group on global fascist imperialisms, but someone was like, oh yeah, we should probably include someone that works on Japan. That's called Kelly. So I didn't, there was like a disjuncture between what people were talking about and what we were thinking about. And so I think one of the ways to illustrate that is to show you guys, this is the Oxford Handbook of Fascism. It's an authoritative definition of fascism. A lot of very important scholars, mostly men, have contributed to it. And the first section deals with sort of the rise of fascism. The second section, which is about 10 chapters long, is all about Italian fascism. The third section is about Nazi Germany. And then the fourth section is called the others. And they go Spain, Hungary, Romania, Yugoslavia and its successor states, Austria, the Netherlands, Belgium, Britain and its empire, France, and then the last chapter is called Japan, the quagmire of particularities. Trish likes that one. So one of the things that I want to do in this class is de-center Europe as the place where fascism emanated from, and think about fascism as emanating in a specific historic moment, rather than coming from a place. So looking at this post-World War I world order, where we see Soviet Bolshevism as a very real and present threat in people's lives, and also the sort of deep resentment that not only Germany, Italy, and Japan felt for their treatment at the Treaty of Versailles, but all of the people in the colonial world. And how come perhaps fascism would have been appealing to them at this specific moment in time. So sort of decentering Europe and rather than taking an approach of place, we'll sort of take a temporal approach to looking at the history of fascism. So the other thing that I noticed was that here were 25 to 30 preeminent scholars of fascism, but they didn't invite anyone that worked on anti-fascism or Soviet responses to fascism or global capitalist responses to fascism. So I think that it's important, if we're going to talk about fascism as a global movement, it really needs to be in conversation with the responses and the reactions to it and the things that it was trying deeply to undermine and to get around. Oh, and the third reason that I want to teach this class, this might be a little bit contentious, and I might get some pushback from this, but generally, we think of fascism as a failed ideology, as something that was defeated. The Nazis, the Japanese, and the Italians were definitely lost during the Second World War. But if we think of fascism as a defeated ideology, we only look for its failures, and we don't take a step back and look at the successes that fascist regimes had. Now, I'm not saying this to sort of dilute or take away from the terrible atrocities committed by fascists during the 20th century, but by focusing solely on those, we miss a lot of the things that these fascist regimes were doing that perhaps either had holdovers into the Cold War era or were continuities into the 50s and 60s, and we also miss some of the successes that they had. And I'm going to give you a specific example about some of these successes from my own recent research. I've been looking at UN reports for the UN was going into North China that had been under Japanese occupation since 1932 with the formation of the Japanese client state Manchukuo. And in 1946, 1947, the UN started sending envoys into this area. And this is mildly hyperbolic, but this is essentially the kinds of things that the UN is saying. Well, thank God the Japanese built roads, otherwise we don't know how we get to access these people. Or thank God the Japanese trained all these nurses, otherwise this entire town would be dead. Like there wouldn't be any people left. So, we imagine that fascism, because there were so many terrible things associated with it, was all negative. But in the early post-war era, there was really a recognition that some of the infrastructure and development projects that the fascists had implemented had a positive effect on the people, especially living in colonial spaces. And this is really important too when we look at the sort of early post-colonial rhetoric on decolonization, which is highly anti-imperial and anti-Soviet. That all of that really resonates with exactly what the Japanese were saying in the 1930s and 40s. And it's sort of repackaged as an anti-colonial nationalist movements in the late 1940s and early 1950s. But they're really just appropriating a lot of the ideological slogans of the Japanese during that time. Okay. Okay. So why do I want to teach this course now? Well, I think that it's important for us as individuals and members of a civil society to be able to recognize the signs of authoritarianism and also be able to think critically about the ways that authoritarian regimes today are either similar or different from the fascists in the 1930s and 1940s, and the reactions to them as well. And I don't think that calling people fascists in the 21st century is really an appropriate term. Same with Nazis, because so many things are very different. The technological mechanisms available to the state are very different. Also, there's no threat of Soviet communism, which was one of the main, sorry Trish. So I think that that's important for us to think about. I also think that the signs and imagery of Nazism and fascism are everywhere. And for us to be able to recognize them and engage critically with them is important for us as global citizens. So this is Nicki Minaj and Chris Brown and Drake. And this is a video by Nicki Minaj from 2014 for her song called Only. And I just took a screenshot of the video, but the whole video is this cartoon that is completely based on Nazi imagery and deeply, deeply embedded with all kinds of Nazi imagery. So I don't really have the answers to these questions, but what does it mean in this moment of Black Lives Matter when an African-American woman is appropriating the imagery of Nazi Germany and then making a music video about sleeping with only one of these men? I don't really know the answer to those questions, but I think that they're important for us to think about, and they're important for us to ask in order for us to be able to, just be critical and engaged citizens. Okay. So I'm sort of structuring this class thematically, and I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the different themes that we'll discuss throughout the semester. How much reading will I have to do? A lot. It's a history class. But we will do different types of readings, from primary sources, secondary sources, and I generally use different kinds of multimedia, videos, images, a lot in my classes. And the way that I'm envisioning this class is that we meet once a week. It's on Tuesdays, and we'll have a couple of sort of blog type assignments, as well as everyone will be responsible for doing a 1 week sort of helping out prepare the seminar for that week. And generally I let the student who's doing that sort of give us an overview of the reading and then prepare us by giving us some questions that we then use as a springboard for the discussion. And then you'll have to do a final paper based on a primary source, which we'll talk about throughout the semester. And I'm really open to any sort of ideas. Like if you want to look at Nazi imagery in Star Wars movies, we can probably find a way for you to figure out how to write a paper about that. Or if you're really into Italian futurism and you're an art history major, we can probably figure out something for you to do in this class. The other project that I'm envisioning, and I only have a name for it and then the sort of final outcome that I'm expecting, is I'd like to do a group collaborative project called Mapping Fascists. And I don't really want to develop a methodology because I want to wait and see who's in the class and draw on the specific skills and interests of the people that are in the class in order to sort of think about how we're going to frame this project. I would like for it to have a public outcome at the end from our research, and I would also like us in groups of smaller groups, so we'll have this larger collaborative project, and then in smaller groups, do some podcasts. So we'll have 5 or 6 podcasts that we can then put up on the internet with this project for other people to see all of the things that we've sort of learned and talked about during the semester. So the approach that I'd like to take is kind of one that is very easy for historians to do when they're teaching classes. I'm going to start with the straw man, and then we're going to spend the semester tearing him down. So what we're going to do is we're going to start by looking at a number of ways that historians have defined fascism, and there's a couple of very succinct and concrete books out there that offer very specific definitions of fascism. And after we spent a week or two sort of familiarizing ourselves with the way people write about fascism, we'll spend the rest of the semester sort of questioning these definitions or thinking critically about what's good about them and what's not good about them. Then we'll talk specifically about anti-fascists and socialists, and do some reading about resistance during people who were either collaborators or resistors, and people who ended up in prison because of their resistance to the fascists. And the class is about 6 months away, so as a normal professor, I'd probably start writing the syllabus about 3 days before the semester starts. But I have been thinking about it, and I've been doing a lot of reading. So I'm just going to give you some examples of the things that I've been thinking about and reading about, so that you can see sort of the overarching trajectory of the thematic approach to this class. So there's a couple books about sort of trans-Pacific and transatlantic fascism. This one, Transatlantic Fascism, Ideology, Violence, and the Sacred in Argentina and Italy, 1919 to 1945. Looking at the connections between Argentina and Italy, as well as Confronting Fascism in Egypt. It's a fabulous and very accessible book that looks at the sort of responses to fascism in the 1930s in Egypt. And then these are two books by one by a Japanese historian and one by a Chinese historian. Maggie Clinton, who teaches at Middlebury College, wrote this great book called Revolutionary Nativism, Fascism and Culture in China, 1925 to 1937. And she really, her main goal here is sort of reinserting the history of fascism into the telling of Chinese history. And this book here is really great, The Fascist Effect, Japan and Italy, 1915 to 1952. So, not everyone knows this, but during the First World War, the majority of the Japanese fleet was stationed in Malta, and it was used to ferry troops from Europe to North Africa, back and forth. And so the relationship between between Italy and Japan, there were lots of Japanese admirals who spent these very formative years stationed in Italy. So their relationship goes way back to way before the establishment of the Anti-Comintern Pact. And so looking at their sort of acknowledgement and relationship in this transnational framework is really interesting. Another theme I'd like to talk about is fascists and empire. These are two brand new books about avant-garde art in the Japanese Empire and ideology and rural youth mobilization in Japan and its colonies, how the Japanese Empire incorporated non-Japanese subjects into their fascist project. And here we have some people going through a Shinto revitalization sort of what's that called? Baptism, I guess. Fascists and race, which is obviously a really important topic. And this one, I specifically would like to look at anti-fascism and race and the strong Soviet influence on the African American movement in the United States in the 1920s, as well as this is about racial categorizations in Asia. So, we think specifically about the racial hierarchy of Nazi ideology and Italian ideology, but the Japanese also had their own racial hierarchies. So here we have the Han Chinese, the Manchurian, the Japanese lady in the middle, the Koreans and the Mongolians, and they're all sort of ordered in categories in different spaces within the empire. Fascists and youth. We have the Boy Scouts, the black shirts, the green shirts, and the real sort of use of young people and indoctrination of young people in throughout the 1930s and 1940s and what this meant. This picture is great. This is for an advertisement for the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. So we see the young Japanese boy dressed in a modern military uniform, surrounded by his Thai friend, who's just a little less civilized than he is. And then all of these other children of empire are sort of wearing their ethnic, garb. They're not quite there yet, but they're all in this project together. Fascists and gender. This is when we'll get to read these amazing love letters to Hitler, where Hitler apparently received more fan mail than Mick Jagger, Madonna, and the Beatles combined. And I think the question we want to ask here is why? Yeah. It seems like when I read these letters, I didn't feel like there was a deep admiration for the Fuhrer. I felt like people were extremely lonely, and there was this new moment of deep loneliness that people were trying to figure out in their lives. So we'll sort of look at what was appealing about perhaps, thinking about Hitler in this way. Fascist virility. I don't think I need to explain the cover of this book, but it's quite a well-known book from the 90s about masculinity. And then this is a brand new book. I haven't actually read it yet. It just came out. The New Man in Radical Right Ideology and Practice, 1919 to 1945. So looking at sort of the ways that the body was used to promote fascism. Fascists in Culture and Fascists in Art. So this is a great book, The Nazi-Fascist New Order for European Culture, or Excavating Modernity, the sort of deep historical roots of Roman antiquity as well as Greek antiquity, and then in the case of the Japanese, drawing on these sort of deep roots of Shinto and a Buddhist past. There's a chapter in my book where the Japanese Empire was trying to create a connection to Afghanistan. Because Afghanistan is this weird, it was situated between the British Empire and the Soviet Union, but it had managed to maintain neutrality during the Second World War. So the Japanese were really interested in creating a geopolitical relationship. And they did this by drawing on an imagined connection to a deep, deep Afghan pre-Islamic past, a Buddhist past that had sort of allowed them to create a connection through Buddhism to Afghanistan that sort of predated the Islamic, predated an Islamic past. And then Excavating Modernity, the Roman Past in Fascist Italy. This book is great too. Hitler at Home, and this sort of looks at the aesthetics of the way Hitler's houses were designed by his architects and his designers, and how they were presented in propaganda. And then Japan's Carnival War, Mass Culture on the Home Front. This is another brand new book. Fascists and Religion. There's tons of books out there about the Italian fascists and their connections to the Vatican, but there's also a lot of other really interesting books, such as this one about Islam and Nazi Germany's war. And this is, you'll see on the title, on the sort of, the little caption on this book is strange and intriguing. So this is a book by probably one of the most prominent novelists of 20th century Japan, Mishima, and he wrote prolifically in the 1930s, 1940s, and 1950s. And then in the 1960s, he became really sort of obsessed with working out and projections of his body as a sort of outward masculinity that was embodied in this sort of post-Japanese fascism. And he wrote this sort of manifesto novel called Sun and Steel right before he committed suicide through the traditional way of seppuku, where he actually disemboweled himself using a samurai sword in a public setting. while trying to also stage a coup against the government in Japan that he disagreed with at the time. So these are like really interesting sources that we can use in class to sort of think critically about fascism. This is a new topic that people are working on now. There's a lot of new scholarship by environmental historians looking at the sort of environmental history of fascism in the 20th century. So were the Germans very good at history of conservation in Nazi Germany, and how green were the Nazis? And the reason these books are specifically focused on Germany is because this is a very new and emerging field. So they'll slowly, other books will start to be written about this, but this is really where we're at. And Fascists in Science and Technology. This might be the best title ever for a book. Fascist pigs. And they're literally talking about pigs. Techno-scientific organisms in the history of fascism. So looking at eugenics beyond the human body and looking at how Nazi scientists and fascist scientists were trying to create not only perfect humans, but perfect species of grain, perfect species of pigs, perfect species of, they were trying to get rid of certain types of diseases. And so really the sort of mixing of fascism with science. So those are some of the things that I've been thinking about, and hopefully you'll join me next fall to continue this conversation. There's a lot more that we can sort of delve into, but I just kind of wanted to give you a little taste of what's to come. And I will leave it at that. I would be very happy to entertain questions, and thank you very much.